Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to US-Japan Research Institute seminars on dynamism of domestic politics and regional integration policy among China, Japan, and the United States. I'm Katsuichi Uchida, President of this USJI, and also Vice President of Waseda University in Tokyo. First, let me introduce USJI. USJI is a non-profit research institute in Washington, D.C., established in April 2009 by leading Japanese universities, now managed by 8 Japanese universities, namely Dosha, Keio, Kyoto, Kyushu, Ritsumeikan, Tsukuba, University of Tokyo, and Waseda universities. And we are financially supported by both Japanese and American business societies. The mission of USJI are to promote policy-related research at our member universities, to organize research teams, dispatch their research results to a wider communities by the medium of English, to nurture young researchers relating to US-Japan relations, and to formulate a community of researchers and policymakers. USJI holds week-long seminars twice a year in March and September, and occasional seminars once or twice a month here in Washington, D.C. And USJI sometimes holds symposium in Tokyo or in Kyoto. With regard to the details of our activities, please visit our website. This week, from the last Wednesday to Tuesday next week, we've held 11 different events covering a wide range of topics. And probably you received the brochures. This explains the 11 different events. And on Monday and Tuesday next week, we'll have different topics. And I hope you are able to come to attend. And this afternoon, we'll have a seminars on dynamism of domestic politics and regional integration policy among China, Japan, and the United States. And I understand that this is very important issues, both Japan, US, and also China and Korea. So I'm quite sure today's discussion will produce very fruitful and productive research results. And before introducing today's moderator, Professor Terada of Dosha University, I'd like to receive your permission to be videotaped. And the videotape is open to the public through the internet. Thank you for your permission. And let me introduce Professor Terada.
Thank you very much, Professor Uchida. Very good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you who are kindly joining us this afternoon. Well, regional integration has been a quite consistent and important topic, not only for the government, but also for USJI. And I started coming to USJI in 2010. So on a number of occasions, I chose the topic for this. But luckily, we've never been giving a very same topic, same content, even same kind of analysis, simply because regional integration has been always moving on. It's a very progressive thing. And this year's, well, the autumn version of the USJI week, again, I chose the same topic. And like last year, Eric Emilia actually kindly joined as a speaker. But this year, I tried to focus more on domestic politics and also its relevance for the regional integration negotiations, if possible. And so our focus just domestic politics. But of course, it's always going on internationally. So it's sort of the linkages between domestic and international politics and economy. I think that's a quite significant way of understanding, hopefully better understanding on what's going on For example, on the TPP or Trans-Pacific Partnership, or RCEP or CJK, many different kind of regional integration frameworks have been developing, and with the different memberships, with different rules and even content. So it's quite a complex situation. So seminar here today, just to provide some small hint to all of you to get, as I mentioned, hopefully better understanding on what's going on here. And I believe we have acquired the fortunate set of the panelists today. From right, my side, to the left, let me introduce briefly, first of all, Matthew Goodman from Center for Strategic and International Studies here at Washington, D.C. Again, I don't need to introduce so much about him in here, but he's involved in a number of the committees and advisory meetings in the U.S. government, including White House and U.S. Department of State, etc. So I'm quite privileged to welcome Matthew here today. And second speaker, Professor Yemin from Boston University. She is talking about the China's domestic politics and international regional integrations, where she has been well-known scholar for her study on the direct investment, particularly in China. And she recently published a book on diasporas and also the China's direct investment. And myself, I'm talking about the Japan's case, while Matthew and Min are talking about US and China respectively. And as a discussion, also I'm quite happy to welcome again Mia Solis from Brookings Institution, where she is serving as the Japan chair. So each speaker should have 15 minutes. Maybe if you want to talk more, okay, 15 minutes should be fine. Usually discussant have a shorter time for speech, but again, she probably wants to talk a little bit more on that. So, and after that, probably 1 hour we can use for Q&A or maybe discussions with people in the floor. So let me first of all introduce Mr. Matthew Goodman.
Thank you to USJI for inviting me to this forum, which I've heard a lot about, but haven't had a chance to participate in yet. So I'm delighted to be included in this very impressive panel. I am very conscious that it is the afternoon, Friday afternoon, on a hot day, Nationals game tonight, and so I'm sure, like me, a lot of you want to go and change into your Nationals garb and watch the game rather than listening to me speak. So I'm going to be shorter than 15 minutes, I hope. I am charged with talking about the relationship between domestic politics and international trade negotiations in the United States. And let me just make two introductory general points about that subject. And that is one, international trade negotiations actually exist because of domestic politics. As an economist, if there weren't domestic politics, then we would all unilaterally disarm and remove our trade barriers, and it would be good for each of us. And so the only reason we go into these negotiations is because there is domestic politics, and that requires us to make trade-offs and to get things and give things in order to achieve a sort of a general benefit. But the reality is that we actually would be better off if we just dropped all our barriers unilaterally. That's a slight oversimplification, but that's just to get that sort of piece of context out there. So you have to talk about it. The real point of saying that is that you have to talk about domestic politics if you want to understand international trade negotiations. And the second broad point is one that's often made, which is that the benefits of trade are widely dispersed among groups and communities that are not well organized and are not very vocal, whereas the costs of trade, or at least the transitional costs, are borne by a relatively narrow but fairly organized and vocal group of people and communities. And so that is really the challenge for domestic management of trade negotiations, is how you explain to people that there are tremendous broad benefits from trade, but that how you handle the cost for the so-called losers from trade and manage the transitional aspects is in a sense an important background point to all of this discussion. So now let me just say a few things about TPP. And I'm going to talk about TPP because my first point is that while there are other things going on in U.S. trade policy and there are other things going on in U.S. Asia policy, right now TPP is U.S., or at least it's the sharp end of the spear of U.S. trade policy and also of U.S. trade Asia policy. That's a slightly more controversial statement, but just to get that one out of the way, absent TPP, our Asia strategy, and certainly President Obama's so-called rebalance or pivot strategy to Asia is not only empty, it is, or not empty is not the right word, but it is not only ineffective, but it's actually counterproductive because the effort seems then to be focused almost exclusively on military and security matters, and so and that's while the region, most of the region wants that engagement and needs it, that form of engagement, they also want and need our economic engagement, and at the moment TPP is the again the sharp end of the spear for our Asian economic strategy. But I'm happy to talk about other aspects of our Asia strategy and APEC and other things. And then with respect to trade, again, there are other things going on, important things like the WTO negotiations and how to try to save something from the now 13-year-old Doha development round and to advance the multilateral trade regime and the rules and market liberalization measures through those negotiations, which is, let's make no mistake, the first best approach to trade policy, which is if you're going to have a trade policy and not unilaterally disarm, then it's best to do multilateral negotiations. But those have been largely stalled, and therefore the U.S. has decided to, while still trying to get something going at the multilateral level, it has focused most of its energy on so-called mega-regional agreements like TPP and its European equivalent, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. But since this is an Asia-related conversation, I think, and because TPP is first out of the hopper and the one that kind of has to get done first in order to move forward with other things, I think it's appropriate to focus on TPP. So that's the kind of first point, is that right now, U.S. trade policy is really all about TPP. The second point is that TPP is hugely important to the United States in terms of its economic and strategic interests. And I usually break down, and slightly oversimplified, the kind of the broad objectives or benefits, you can define it however you like, of TPP into sort of three categories. The first is growth and jobs. So there's the economic importance of TPP to help create new market opportunities, to create a more open and well run international order that creates new global export opportunities and, frankly, import opportunities for the United States, because, by the way, as an economist, imports are not a bad thing. They're just something you have to, in fact, they're the good thing, the thing we all want. We all want to import. Exports are hard work. You have to work in order to enjoy the benefits of imports. But certainly, TPP is about market opening on both sides in other markets and for the countries themselves entering into these arrangements. Certainly, that's true of the U.S. So, and I could give you numbers about the growth and jobs impact, but I'll just give you one, which is Peter Petrie from Brandeis, working with the Peterson Institute here, has done econometric analysis of the potential benefits of TPP. It's made under certain assumptions, but the bottom line is that a completed TPP would potentially generate annual global income gains by 2025 on the order of on the order of 300 billion US dollars, and if combined into a broader free trade area of the Pacific, Asia Pacific, could generate annual global income gains on the order of $2 trillion, which is real money, even for those of us in Washington who are used to billions at least. And the United States benefits from that are also, and I actually off the top of my head can't remember the US numbers, but they're substantial. They're in the hundreds of billions of dollars of gains. So it's important for economic reasons. Secondly, the second reason we're pursuing TPP is to reinforce our strategic presence in the Asia Pacific, and I've already sort of discussed that because the U.S. is a Pacific power. It is not an Asian geographic entity, and yet we have tremendous interests across political, security, economic interests, and we have been engaged in this region for over 200 years, and particularly in the last 100 years, we have fought a number of wars in that part of the world, left a legacy of military and security presence that has ensured peace and stability in the region. But we have deep economic interests in the region, and we need to be there to both support the prosperity and stability of the overall region and to support our own interest in being engaged. And TPP is let's say, not in the theoretical world the only way to achieve that, but right now it is the principal way that we can enjoy the benefits of our engagement and our presence in the Asia Pacific region. And the third thing the third sort of objective or benefit that would come from a TPP agreement for the United States is to update and uphold the rules of the international trading system. And I use those two terms advisedly because update because the rules are, while they've served us all well, are out of date in many respects. They don't account for sort of, and most trade rules don't account for the obvious digital revolution. They don't account for the fact that trade is no longer really trade, it's really supply chain management or global value chain management. In other words, not a world in which you make cloth in a little village cottage factory and move it onto a ship and sail it to Portugal in exchange for wine, but you actually think up ideas in one place, gather pieces of design from a lot of other parts of the world, put it together in yet another place, and then distribute it all over the place, and with lots of virtual activity going on around all of that, and services and other things. So in that world, you have to have rules that are not just things that deal with border issues like customs and other border issues, but that they deal with those, but also deal with the many issues behind the border, from regulatory systems to investment policies to intellectual property protections to labor and environmental standards. As the U.S. Construes, you can, and you not only can, but there is a lot of argument about some of the specifics of that, but the basic concept of getting to behind the border measures is an important part of why we're doing TPP, and to update these rules. And the other is to uphold them because they are under some challenge. They've always been challenged in the sense that we've all violated the rules one way or another, and yet have largely operated within this system of rules created in the wake of World War II. And yet now, with the rise of new emerging markets in the world, which were not really full participants, or at least in their current governmental form, we're not participants in the establishment of the rules, who have at least an aspiration to help shape the rules, if not actually try to change the rules in some important ways. I actually think it's more of the former than the latter. In other words, there's a sort of an aspiration to be a leader and to be among I'm of course talking about China, India, Brazil, countries like that, that want to understandably be have more voice in shaping the rules. Whether they actually whether they actually have a legitimate beef about the rules themselves is another question. I think some of that gets lost in the shuffle about who's in charge, but that's a whole other conversation. So So this is very important. Now, the point I was going to make, however, was that right now TPP is really a matter, again, it's not an internal proposition, but at the moment is all about the US and Japan. And again, we can cut to the chase, and Terada Sensei is probably going to talk about some of this. But the US and Japan as the two largest participants and the first and third largest economies in the world are really what everybody is playing for. They're the two largest countries that don't have a trade agreement within this bloc. And they are still bogged down in discussions not about those new issues that I discussed a minute ago, but really about the old issues. We agree about most of the new issues. So really right now TPP is all about the US and Japan trying to come to an agreement on market access in both countries. And the point I just made, although I'm not supposed to talk about Japan, but I would just say that the points I made about why the United States wants and needs TPP apply almost identically to Japan. They need it for growth and jobs. They need it for their presence and our presence in the region, and they need it to uphold and update the rules of the system. And frankly, I think 51-49, even though we both need it, I think Japan needs it more than the United States. And yet, the dynamic hasn't quite played out that way in the sense that Japan is still not, I think, quite as committed to this effort as the United States is. So, but that's a 51-49 proposition, don't get me wrong. We're both very serious about it. It's just that I think there's a little more sense of urgency and importance to this being attached here, even though I think the interests are greater in Japan. Finally, and this gets to the real topic today, and then I'll stop. I think that politics is critically important in TPP in both countries, in all the countries, in all 12 countries involved in TPP. And I'll come back to that, but let me just say the punchline, which is again, 51-49 proposition. I think the politics in the United States are marginally harder than the politics in Japan. And again, I'll get rid of Japan here quickly by saying that, Abe-san doesn't have a challenger within his party. He doesn't have a party to challenge his party. He doesn't have an election for another couple of years, well, local elections and things, but he doesn't have a serious threat to his political position right now. And he's made the hard political decision already to join TPP. And so, relatively speaking, taking the next step politically, I think, is not as hard for him as it is for President Obama, who does have an election coming up, who does not have a secure position except that he's president for another 2 years, but he will be a lame duck president after November 4th, and he has severe opposition to pretty much everything he does from his legislature. And so the politics are really, really hard, and I guess that's where I'll finish, is just that, and we can get into the details of this, and I'm sure we'll in the discussion, but again, the good news is that, as I said, the benefit, at the very beginning, I said the benefits of trade are widely dispersed, and that's reflected in our politics, that a majority, I'm confident, of the US Congress representing the American people supports trade and will support TPP, a good TPP agreement. And so I think I'm with a fairly high degree of confidence that TPP will eventually pass the US Congress. I'm just not going to say when that's going to happen because there's a lot of politics. Well, there's a lot of negotiations and there's a lot of politics before that is going to happen. There have been a number of false deadlines. I'm still hopeful that we can pull an iron out of the fire before the November meeting at APEC of the TPP leaders, but I'm not putting a lot of my own personal investment wealth onto that proposition or that bet, but it's possible. If the US and Japan have a breakthrough on agriculture market access, it is possible there could be a dynamic that would lead to at least an agreement in principle, because many of the other issues, I think, will fall away once that happens. So I think that the politics are very hard here, because in the end, the president's own party does not have a majority support for trade, although I personally think that majority is probably, that minority is probably larger than people think. I'm sure it's larger than people think, and I think it is actually growing. Polling suggests that there's more support for trade, including on the Democratic Party, but I would say as a proposition today, the Democratic Party is not going to support TPP in a majority, and therefore the president would have to buck his own party on an issue, and that's a very difficult proposition for any leader of a party to go against their own party and favor the other party's interests, which in this case favor trade. And finally, I'll just say, so I don't think in the short term movement on either the Trade Promotion Authority transfer of authority from the Congress to, or it's really the guidance given by Congress to the administration that would enable TPP or a trade negotiation like that normally to be even negotiated, let alone concluded. I don't think that Trade Promotion Authority is going to be enacted, certainly not before November, probably not right after November, but I do think it's possible it could be enacted in a new Congress and setting the stage for possibly 5 minutes later a vote on TPP. In other words, TPA is a condition, for a precondition, I think, for a clean TPP vote, but it doesn't necessarily have to come well in advance in order to finish the negotiations. That's a controversial statement, but I believe that. So I will stop there, and there's a lot of detail behind that, but let the other speakers have their 2 cents. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rashi, for explicitly clarifying the Americans' interest in and also potential for profits to be accrued from TPP. Also, I personally appreciate his comment on US-Japan relations, particularly within TPP, because I don't need to touch on a little bit in my presentation later. And also, I'm quite impressed by his stories about the TPA in a sense, quite positive way. And for some of the clarification probably need, but I probably ask later on about it. Well, the America is obviously a significant TPP member state, but not joining the RCEP and other countries as a state like CJK. But of course, China is quite a dominant state in those frameworks. But on the other hand, recently China has been showing interest in the TPP as well. So why? So this kind of question could be addressed by me. Yes.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And this is really intimidating. In Boston, the talk, we always have like a 20 audience or 30 talks, and facing this large crowd, I'm a little bit nervous. First, I want to thank Harada-san for inviting me to USJI event. This is the third invitation, and I apologize I missed the first 2, but I think I made it the most interesting one at the most interesting time. I really appreciate this invitation also for a personal, professional reason. But I left China and East Asia regionalism for about 4 years. And my book was published in 2010, and then I moved to the second book and then forget about it. And now with this invitation, I'm truly back to East Asian regionalism. And during the summer, I did extensive research in Beijing. I collected tons of materials on China's regional policy. So hopefully there will be some publication coming out, and all of us can benefit from those materials. Because frankly, not many China scholars are working on regionalism. So thanks again. The TPP and China, this is actually quite an odd sentence, but China is not in any way part of the TPP negotiation. But when I started research in China, TPP is a very hot topic in China. I went back to China with 2 research projects in mind. One was innovation and returnee, and I tried to set up interviews. Nobody cared about it clearly. But TPP, I lined up all kinds of interviews, and it was really easy to collect the material. And then that's puzzling why China would be so intensely interested in the TPP dialogue. And the second comment I want to make is, Harada-san asked me to talk about domestic politics. But in the foreign policy or regional policy, domestic politics or Japanese style or US styles just do not exist in China. The kind of interest groups, how the winners or losers and how they affect foreign policy in the lobby or informal lobby kinds of ways are just not present. But still, it doesn't mean China is homogeneous. And my talk today will actually show there are lots of divergence in organizational interests, and there are lots of very influential interest groups. So maybe these 2 are really Chinese-style domestic politics. How can we move down, please? Okay, so I'll talk about these 4 questions, and I haven't really timed my presentation, so if I go over time, and let me know. The first one is, how does China view TPP? So the divergence in the views. And the second is how China's regional policy has been moving along, particularly since 2005 to the current stage. And the third is what are the new moves that in China's regional policy. The last one will be very brief, and some of the obstacles to China's regionalism in my view. The divided views. So again, it's a very hot topic. So there are hundreds of articles published in China in the last 18 months or so on TPP. And the writers or the scholars have relatively good sense of why America is pursuing TPP, why Japan is pursuing TPP, as well as the positions of the other parties. But the division is really in how China should react to the TPP negotiation. And there are 3 main groups. The first group is called skeptics, which are all resistors, and you wouldn't find this group's opinion in the writings, in the published Chinese journals. So these really are reviewed by my interview people that I talked to. The skeptics, like the mainstream views, they believe that America pursued this TPP as a strategy to contain or at least to undermine China's presence or interest in the region. And their advice is that China should just ignore it and pursue its own bilateral ties outside the TPP framework. For instance, if Japan, US, South Korea, Singapore are having this organization, then China perhaps should do something in different regions. And I'll come back to this point later in the new moves. The second, I wouldn't call it mainstream, but this second is mostly represented in the published articles. But from private conversations, this actually doesn't really appear as the mainstream views. But it's what I call moderate cautioners. So they are careful of the fallout from TPP to China. And they believe that China should pay close attention to it and be informally involved and yet not taking a stand at this point, because the TPP standards are really not practical from China's point of view. The last one, this one, perhaps an equal share among the three are those by liberals. So they believe that the TPP standards are higher than other trade negotiations. Yet what the TPP touched upon are exactly the direction that China's reform should focus on. For instance, environment, labor standards, state-owned enterprise. I mean, these reforms, large reforms, are on the pipeline of China's reform agenda. So this group actually argues the government should be more actively engaged and using this external negotiation or informal environment to push China deepen its reform. Again, so far we are yet to see any consensus. Perhaps China would pursue all these different approaches to the ongoing TPP negotiation to a different extent. I'll be really quick on this because I think most of people that I know from the U.S. point of view, when they look at China from 2008 onwards, they saw the nationalist movement and the anti-Japan protesters and difficulties with South Korea, difficulty in South China Sea. So that's the narrative that we are very familiar. But during my research, I actually found in the regional cooperation or regional coordination, the progress has been quite substantial. So what I call is more like a backlashes and yet very steady growth. So there are activities in the ASEAN +3 framework that's being deepened and becoming more substantial. And the Chinese funding for regional cooperation has been steadily increasing. The Asian desk of the ministries are hiring people, more and more people. So these are all very steady increase in the support for regional cooperation. And China's the think tank and the network of East Asian think tanks. This is one of the APT framework, and they added the network of ASEAN and China think tanks. So, and they also again hiring more people, getting more funding. And of course, in the recent 2 years, so the funding actually doubled. So previously it's a steady increase, in the recent 2 years it's just doubled. And later I'll come back to this point again. But one thing that is different during this period compared to before was the ASEAN centrality. And I think many of you know the term of ASEAN being in the driver's seat, and that was what I know in 2008. But then ASEAN is no longer satisfied to be in the driver's seat because they want to play more substantive roles. So the ASEAN centrality, meaning that ASEAN seeks to be the only frameworks that any other frameworks had to be ASEAN plus. It has to have ASEAN and ASEAN plus this group or this country. So the ASEAN centrality has been pushed by ASEAN for many years. Now I think it's getting support from China as well. Some of the new developments and RCEP. Most of people think RCEP as a competitive framework with TPP. And I think when I started the research, I thought China would be very supportive of the RCEP. And that prediction was supported in my interviews and also in published works. So RCEP, China has uncategorically offered wholehearted support for RCEP, and yet it's not enthusiastic support. So the Chinese are very practical about RCEP because they recognize that RCEP members are just too diverse in size, in development level, in culture. So it's not a very practical trade bloc. So the welfare gains or any practical term would be very difficult to pull through. But in order to counterweight TPP, China would spend nothing at supporting some kind of political union under the framework of RCEP. Again, RCEP is a demonstration of ASEAN centrality, and it's ASEAN plus the other countries. The China-Japan-Korean framework, which I really liked in my 2010 book, and there are some new moves, and for instance, the investment treaties and the CGK Secretariat, and everybody that I talked to are quite happy with the Secretariat, and also the Chinese viewed that CGK FT actually is most practical, most welfare enhancing from China's point of view, because these two neighboring economies are major trading partners and investment partners of China. And their technology levels, their different sectoral levels are just very complementary with China. So from economic point of view, CGK FT would work for China the best, but for politics. With ASEAN, China, in the recent 2 years, because of the TPP, they actually conceded a great deal. The DOC refers to the Declaration of Code of Conduct, the Declaration of Conduct in South China Sea that was passed in 2002, and that was lauded as a major concession and a major achievement in South China Sea multilateralism. China has recently entered Code of Conduct negotiation with ASEAN countries, and they also set up the so-called two rail mechanism. So some parts of the country they would negotiate as a group, and the other parts ASEAN countries will enter a separate group of negotiation. Nevertheless, this COC is seen as a big achievement. The Xi Jinping, so the current president, has appeared to have very clear strategy, new strategy regarding East Asia. And the two terms that are talked a lot are Asia Common Destiny, so it's like 亚洲命运共同体. And the second is 一带一路. It's the Silk Road Economic Ring and Maritime Silk Road. These are both visions proposed by the current president and then reinforced by the premier and foreign minister. And I will explain why this is particularly attractive to China. The Silk Road Economic Ring refers to the economic connections and infrastructure project connecting China to Central Asia all the way to East Europe and then southward to Southeast Asia. And to China, this is a perfect economic diplomacy, so giving some economic benefits to the smaller neighbors. And to gain diplomatic advantage. So that's their preferred method for a while. And the second rationale is domestic reform. So regions within China that are bordering the Silk Road economic ring are currently lagging behind economic reform in China. Those are not as developed, as liberalized as the rest of China. So now with this economic zone, they're hoping that liberalization could be sped up, investments could go into this area. And the interest groups, so local governments have been very vocal in trying to get on the list. They are in this zone. And state-owned enterprise, the large infrastructure-based SOEs are expected to benefit from these efforts. Okay, I'll conclude very quickly with the obstacles. The first obstacles, actually, I share this view, but this was offered to me by Chinese practitioners on regionalism. They feel that the US-dominated bilateral security architecture is a fundamental hinder to multilateralism in Asia. So when situations change, the momentum toward multilateralism would change in their dealings with the regional powers. The second is China's nationalist factions. I deliberately called nationalists because China is very large. There are different groups. Some of the groups that are more connected with the military are more nationalist. And the multilateralists or the liberal factions actually are quite frustrated with the other group. But why nationalism would be so critical to China is a very deep question, and I have my own thoughts, so I would be happy to engage questions on this later on. The last one, as reviewed by the interviews and the materials, are the lack of coordination among Chinese different actors engaged in cross-border development. So for instance, the NDRC, the National Development and Research Council, a super ministry involved in development. This is very, very powerful ministry. So most cross-border large infrastructure projects only need to go through this super ministry. But this ministry is not subject to any the practices set in place by Ministry of Commerce or Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So the infrastructure, once it creates a problem, that becomes a diplomatic problem. But the approving agency is really beyond the practitioners in international relations or regional relations. And local governments are the same. So if local governments have very large projects, they only need to go to the NDRC. They are not going to go to Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So the lack of coordination are creating problems in China's neighboring regions that the diplomatic folks are running to put out fires, but the fires always will come up in the next round of development. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, me actually highlighted the different political approaches, the systems in China compared with the US and Japan. But the very last point, the difficulty of coordinating the opinions and views existing in different ministries are quite similar to what we observed in Japan, for example. But I'm not sure about the United States. Okay, next, well, it's final country case study. It's on Japan. And I myself try to start with the quite familiar map, which I have used over the last 2 years to indicate the Japan's position in a regional integration framework. So I think some of you might remember this one. Again, I mentioned in the beginning, Japan actually is the only nation in the world who has been participating in the multiple regional integration frameworks in East Asia and the Pacific, the TPP, and also RCEP. It's a long one. It's a so-called 7+6 FTA, or something like that. And also, just to mention, CJK, China, Japan, Korea, corporate frameworks. And in addition, Japan has also engaged in FTA talks with the European Union, like the United States. And again, only Japan is participating in it. If all of them were successfully implemented, the current coverage of the trade by the Japan's FTA partner, which is about 18%, will be increased to the 85%. But of course, the question obviously is when and how this the grand idea could be realized. But again, this page just tries to demonstrate Japan's position. And well, again, we have three major regional integration frameworks. But how we try to explain Japan's interest in doing simultaneously promoting the regional integration negotiations. So I just picked up by reading some government documents as well as the political leaders' statements, etc. We'll identify the three major variables. Well, number one is actually China factor, and not only economically but also politically as well. And if you try to read Prime Minister Abe's press conference statement in March, I think 15th, 2013, soon after Japan announced its participation in TPP, he actually highlighted, of course, he hardly mentioned about China, but the importance of the variables or elements, for example, rule of origin, rule of the law, or democracy, this kind of stuff, actually he mentioned in the context of Japan's participation in TPP, and he highlighted the significance of the working together with the United States. And even Mr. Froman, the USJI, also mentioned, the US TPP is not only the economic and trade issue, but also quite significant in terms of geopolitics. So I think at least the Japanese and American political leaders tend to share this kind of political security or even strategic-driven approaches to the regional integrations. And number two, it's a very traditional approach, the market expansion. Just try to find the market for exports. And again, the Abenomics, and the first, the arrow was actually the increasing the quantitative, the distribution. And then why Abe is doing that was obviously to help the export countries more export by purposefully reducing or decreasing the value of Japanese yen against US dollars. So, in this case, market expansion is quite significant in terms of Abenomics as well. So that's why the third arrow, which was considered to be so-called helping the economic growth by implementing the regulatory activities, of course including the promoting regional integration. But this part is not necessarily well addressed by the government yet. But many people actually expect, in a sense, particularly business side, that could be more strongly linked up to the Abenomics, or in this case, broader economic strategy of the Japanese government and the Prime Minister. But one probably problem, particularly in terms of TPP, is the TPP, the market access negotiation, as Mashu just highlighted in his presentation today, it's more bilateral. But RCEP has employed sort of multilateral collective approach to the market access negotiations. So that could be quite useful for Japanese multinational companies who tend to expand the so-called supply chain networks, production networks, in particular in the East Asian side. Again, basics of FTA, you need to identify any parts of the product consisting of the big, product should be identified as, this was producing in Japan or something. But of course, there are a number of ways of the calculating whether this is made in Japan or not. If not made in Japan, you have to continue to pay tariffs. So in this case, and to simplify the so-called rule of origins, we need sort of the collective or regional or simplified rule of origin, RORs. But it seems to me TPP doesn't employ this sort of approach. There's one view that well, okay, Japanese multinational companies, production networks or supply chain networks are mainly developed in East Asian side. But TPP, of course, includes so-called the Americas countries, Mexico, Chile, and Peru. And Japan's, the companies do not necessarily so much invest in those kind of areas. So even TPP employing more bilateral market access negotiation as a result, or maybe 50, 60, I don't know eventually how many bilateral market access agreements within the TPP frameworks, but probably it doesn't probably so much matter for Japanese companies. But however, recently Prime Minister Abe went to the Latin American countries, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, those countries. And together with a lot of Japanese big businesses, because those companies are strong interest in investing in those Latin American states. And if the investment well developed and covering the United States, and of course in the TPP completion, or some companies, again, I've never been working in manufacturing companies, they might take some strategy of utilizing these TPP frameworks for setting up their own supply chain strategies, which probably hardly never been exposed to the public. But this kind of idea still exists in Japan, particularly by reading the METI, Ministry of Economic and Industries, and white papers, and etc. This was very emphasized. So my second point is, if I mentioned in the very first point, China, politically and economically very significant factor behind the Japan's growing interest in TPP and etc. Of course, very traditional approach, expanding, helping the exporting countries to cultivate the market. It's still an important element. And number three, investment liberalizations. Again, companies going overseas invest so much. But particularly, as I mentioned, China in the beginning, China still does not provide the fully-fledged liberalization for investment. There are a number of regulations, even including the performance requirement. And the point is, as we mentioned, China, Japan, Korea actually started FTA, but it changed later. Investment treaty should be implemented first. It became effective in May this year. But still, there are a number of exceptions and exceptions. For example, pre-establishment investment is actually exempted from the current CJK investment treaty. So still, this is sort of the area in which Japanese companies express as a concern whenever they try to invest in China, according to JETRO's survey it just published last year. So if you look at the Japanese bilateral FTA, Japan has so far signed 12, mainly East Asian countries. Actually, investment treaty is included in all. So TPP, obviously, RCEP, hopefully, and CJK, yes, we're done already. So three major political, market expansion, and investment. These probably three major variables could be viewed as sort of the lenses for analyzing Japanese interest in regional integration, which I just described in the first page. TPP, RCEP, CJK, but probably different benefits Japan might eventually get. TPP, as already mentioned by Hashi, the new rule making, cutting edge in agendas, purely focusing on, not purely, well, of course, mainly focusing on behind the border issues, even including the labor and environmental issues, which have never been put in a Japanese FTA which signed so far. But that's fine, because East Asian developing countries tend not to be happy with this kind of rules. But Japan was quite happy with the United States in this case, who always put this issue on the bilateral or even regional FTA like NAFTA. RCEP probably, sorry to say here, but China is included. And also ASEAN, 10 all member countries also exist. That's why probably we're not expecting the high standard 21st century new rule making mechanism within RCEP. So it's a bit different from TPP. But importance of RCEP is including China, India, Indonesia, Thailand, all of them not member of TPP. But you know how big these economies are. So if realized, and also these developing countries tend to have higher protections, tariffs. So that could be probably reduced, hopefully eliminated. So again, RCEP is quite significant, particularly as I mentioned, covering the East Asian region in which Japanese MNCs have enjoyed the expanded production networks. CJK, as I mentioned, investment liberalization and protection overseas, particularly China, because it was pushed jointly by South Korea and Japan together. By FTA, CJK FTA, we just observed the completion of the fifth round of the negotiation just yesterday. But according to newspapers, well, nowhere to go, even in simple and traditional matter which is market access. And Korea is now much more interested in concluding bilateral FTA with China, according to them, hopefully this year. And the target is, in terms of the market access, covering 90% of the products. But when it comes to CJK, trilateral FTA, China and Korea strongly resist accepting the Japan's proposal, 90%. Currently 60%, maybe something like that. I don't know why. It may be related to politics, Japan's and trade relations with South Korea and China. But my last point is, of course, Japan has been in a good position, if realized, for probably good for the Japanese economic growth in the future. But the number of obstacles which Japan needs to overcome in realizing it. But of course, most obvious one is agricultural liberalization. And again, it's ongoing process. I mean, the deregulations and reforms in the Japanese agriculture market. So therefore, what I'm saying today is not suddenly exactly what eventually be materialized. But my own views, particularly by looking at what's going on in Japan in terms of the agricultural deregulations or liberalization, is a bit optimistic. I can't say very optimistic, but probably first time for us to say some movement going on in terms of changing something in the Japanese domestic politics in relation to agriculture. Well, this diagram, which also I showed in February when the media kind of invited me to the symposium in Brookings. So some of you, if you were there, might remember. It's not my own product, it's actually copied from Nikkei. But interestingly, these products, 930, Japan has never been touching on in an FTA, which means never been interested in liberalizing. So therefore they call sanctuary, seiki in Japanese. And the rice was put on the top. Well, I don't know why, because I'm not writing this diagram myself. But probably rice considered most difficult to liberalize. But interestingly, America is not interested in touching this rice, because Japan has actually imported foreign rice as a so-called minimum access rice, agreed upon in the Uruguay round. But more than 60 or nearly 70% of this foreign rice is actually Americans. So if liberalized, which means American rice producers may have a harsher competition within the Japanese market. So America is now targeting pork and beef. And because particularly beef, because harsher America's competitors actually gaining the more market share within Japanese market, which is, yes, Australia. And Australia and Japan FTA was just signed recently. I'm actually writing Australia and Japan FTA paper for USJI boys So if you're interested, please visit the website. Why Japan using this bilateral approach, particularly for mobilizing the negotiations in TPP? Okay, I have to finish. Sorry. But the point is, these are all, most of them, not all, agriculture products which Japan never touched on in any FTA Japan signed so far. But why I'm saying more optimistic, there are three probably major issues, must be more, but at least currently more. Well, Abe is very committed to agricultural reforms. If you look at whatever he mentioned about agricultural reforms, including his speech in Davos last February, it's quite clear. And important stuff was, again, Masha also mentioned, Abe probably continued to maintain his government until probably 2016 or 17, because there would be no national level election. And as you know, he was just, the reshuffling the second government. And as a result, this was just mentioned 2 days ago by Yomiuri Shimbun, 64% the supporting ratio. It's quite high. And I don't think at the moment there's no politician within LDP who try to challenge Abe's positions. That if Abe highlighted agricultural reform as one of the top agendas which he promoted under the second administration, it's quite interesting to see who actually tried to challenge it. In my view, I think in this case, Koizumi's case, particularly for promoting privatization of postal services, again, a number of the LDP politicians tried to challenge it. But treatment of them by Koizumi was terribly bad for them. And their political life, some of them actually ended over there. I don't think Abe is a similar kind of politician like Koizumi. But I think still many people remember that, particularly challenging the prime minister with a high portion of support. So it's very interesting who tried to challenge it, if any. Now, but the working group, the regulatory reform committee, this was actually chaired by Prime Minister Abe, on agriculture. There are a couple of the number of the working groups under the RC. And the report on agricultural reform was just released in last June, I guess. And advising Prime Minister Abe to take radical action, including dismantling of USJI Zenchu, it might be the most powerful pressure group in Japan. Again, some LDP politicians try to say it's too radical and take some more modest approaches to these approaches. But these politicians, who are considered to be a hardcore protectionist of agriculture, started saying at least JA should not act as a pressure group. They purely focus more on the promoting the farmers. So even now, this kind of the quite radical advice by the working group, might be probably put on agenda again. Finally, gentan in Japanese, which means curtailing rice production through the decrease in acreage of rice paddies in exchange for subsidy payment, can be eliminated in 6 years. This was a system for maintaining the rice price high. But if eliminated, this system in 6 years, this 6 years is important because I realized he needs to go through the national level election in 2016-17. So still, to win election, such kind of agricultural support might be considered to be significant. But after that, this gentan system will be over. In this case, harsher competition exists. Production costs would be higher. So in this case, only larger scale rice producers could survive. But of course, they can create rice as much as they like. Abundant, that's fine, they try to export it. So in this case, TPP, RCEP, CJK, including agricultural liberalization, becomes very significant. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's just going on in Japan this month. So I don't know at the moment how these kind of agricultural reforms can be landed. But my view is, by looking at this kind of the trends which is going on in Japan, I can be probably optimistic. Thank you very much. Okay, finally, I'd like to invite Mia Solis as a discussion.
Thank you. Can I start from here? The mic is on, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to participate in this panel. I think that we have listened to three terrific presentations that have laid out really a very rich set of issues on a topic that I actually care a lot about, the domestic politics of trade. I happen to be writing a book on this, and I'm trying to come up with some sort of framework to try to understand why trade policies are becoming increasingly complex when it navigates the domestic political process in many different countries, and how that could be applied to Japan. So I learned a great deal from the presentations today. And what I'm going to, my comments today really reflect just some reactions to what I just heard this afternoon. On the intricate link between domestic politics and trade, clearly, they're joined at the hip. We can think about other issues in political economy where perhaps the public is not following as closely, where the mobilization is not so quick, but in trade, that's certainly not the case. Every trade agreement is heavily influenced by what the domestic political conditions are. And I agree completely with Matt on that point. What I would then add to that is that what makes this really interesting is that that is an evolving relationship. And it's becoming more and more challenging to successfully navigate the domestic politics of trade because that boundary has shifted. Quite simply because the scope of the trade agenda has also changed. The boundary between what was domestic and what was international clearly is not longer the same. We now have trade agreements that are more ambitious, that are trying to tackle to reduce not only tariff levels, but are now taking head-on issues like non-tariff barriers, where it's clearly understood that if you are now operating in a world economy where the fragmentation of production, where the spread of global supply chains is the order of the day, then the trade rules of the past are simply out of date. And then this opens a very difficult but very necessary agenda of how you update that trade set of trade rules to reflect the reality on the ground. And there's a lot of political domestic pushback because many people have many doubts about the merits of the trade agenda, about what is the appropriate boundary, and about how those decisions are made. So let me then just illustrate why I think that the trade discussion is so interesting and so challenging and something I'm actually grappling with daily. And to begin with, I just should confess that I find that I'm spread very thin because this trade agenda is increasingly growing, and therefore the set of issues that I must deal with when I try to explain what explains the domestic politics of trade is ever growing. Think, for example, these very heated debates as to how the benefits of trade liberalization are distributed within a society, because I think Matt was also exactly right when he highlighted a very old insight, right? That trade generates aggregate gains, but there's going to be concentrated losers. And how do we make sure that we address the needs of those disadvantaged sectors in a way in which does not hinder either the necessary economic reforms to promote competitiveness. So there's a very heated debate here in the United States, for example, as to whether trade liberalization, globalization promotes income inequality. And we need to address those concerns to show that indeed trade is actually just a modest contributor to that there are other forces like technological change and so forth that seem to be driving those issues. And whenever there is indeed a reason to be concerned that trade liberalization may increase income inequality, that needs to be addressed properly. Another very heated debate I think that the trade agenda is now generating, and I think it's really striking when you think about it, has to do increasingly with the fabric of the democratic process. And all this debate about trade promotion authority, about the transparency of trade negotiations, about the accountability of the trade negotiators has to do with that debate as to what is the legitimacy of these trade agreements, how are they crafted, and how we actually sort of try to reconcile this need for having confidentiality in the trade negotiations with the need also to have input from civil society. And that's a very difficult balance to achieve. And I think, therefore, that the trade agenda is presenting us with very different and complex challenges, and it's reflected in the actions of the three countries that we are now discussing today, the United States, China, and Japan. And I would like to offer just some brief comments based on each presentation and mostly pose questions for further discussion. I think that the argument that Matt made as to why the TPP is a central piece of the US trade strategy is impeccable. I completely agree with what is at stake in this trade negotiation. But then this raises the question as to whether the United States is going to be its own worst enemy, if you will, in the sense that the domestic politics will not align in order to allow for the TPP to be successful, to wrap the negotiation on time, and to actually bring it to a successful ratification. And I would argue, and I would love to hear what Matt has to say, we look at what's been going on in domestic politics of US trade, that the panorama may not be as optimistic perhaps as what Matt was discussing, and frequently I come as a skeptic in these negotiations or in these discussions, so I would like to hear Matt's reactions to this. The way I would see it is that since the negotiation of NAFTA, what we have in the United States is a fractured consensus on the merits of trade policy, and that those lines have, if anything, hardened over time. And then to that, I would add more recent dynamics that do not augur well either for a speedy, smooth, successful ratification of the TPP. And by this, I mean the climate of political gridlock in Washington, the increasingly dysfunctional interaction between the executive and legislative branch, and how this actually may create a lot of concern among other TPP partners regarding the ability of the United States to deliver. And I could not agree more with Matt that if the United States has put forward a very compelling view of what Asia-Pacific integration should be, in the context in which the WTO continues to be deadlocked. And if the United States has made the linchpin a central piece of its engagement with the region, the failure to deliver at the end, I think, would be an extremely serious blow to the credibility of US foreign policy, including its trade agenda. But it has broader geopolitical implications as well. And I think we should all ask ourselves, what if there is no TPP? What would the consequence of that would be for the display of US leadership in the region and for the advancement of rulemaking at the international level again, given that the WTO is not doing so well, and the last glimmer of hope when there was a trade facilitation agreement does not look that positive now that India has sort of vetoed that outcome. So what are then the prospects that the TPP can pass muster within the US domestic political process? And I would like to ask Matt also to address, I think, a very interesting debate that's going on today among watchers of US trade policy. And that is, what role for Trade Promotion Authority, that instrument by which Congress delegates to the executive the authority to negotiate trade agreements and promises to vote just yes or no on the agreement and to do this expeditiously. I've heard two different positions. I have my own view on this, which I think is closer to what Matt was saying, but I would love to hear what Matt has to say about this debate or the other panelists as well. One view is that we don't need Trade Promotion Authority. That is just in order to wrap up TPP. That's just a procedural voting rule. And that, if you have a strong agreement, you can make a persuasive case and bring people on board and vote for TPP. The other view, the one that I subscribe to, argues that TPA is certainly not just a procedural rule. It is a key signaling mechanism that there is the domestic will, the domestic political consensus in this country that this is in the best interest of the United States and is in the best interest of involved countries in Asia Pacific, and therefore that the United States is prepared to deliver. So then this brings a question, I think, as to what is the window of time that we have to get that TPA in place and get a TPP voted on. And I would make the case that the time is running out. If we think that the midterm elections are having a chilling effect, as they surely are, on the discussion on TPA, imagine what the presidential elections will do to the trade agenda. It's not going to be easy to move forward with this agenda with the shadow of the presidential elections. So therefore, that leaves us perhaps with the first quarter, maybe a little bit after, of 2015 for real action on TPA and TPP? Are the political conditions there for these to happen? Then, let me then move on, and I may be forgetting some questions just because this was just a quick reaction to what I heard this afternoon. Let me move on to China, and I think Minye's presentation was really fascinating, and every time I hear more about the unpacking of the Chinese thinking, the process, the way in which different actors think about regional integration and the TPP in particular, I think it's extremely useful to learn more about this. I have several questions and comments for Minye. I found very interesting this discussion about the different views in China, the skeptics, the moderates, the liberalizers. And my question is, if, Minye, you could give us an idea as to how this spectrum of views and opinions are reflected in China's top leadership, because that's what's going to matter regarding what China actually does vis-a-vis the TPP. Were you able, through your interviews, to get a sense of how the key decision makers in China are leaning towards? What of these views, which of these views are really influencing their thinking, and therefore are they ready to move in one direction or another? Then the other bigger question, and that might be a more academic question, is I really love the phrase Chinese-style interest politics. Can you unpack that for us? I understand that it's going to be very different from when we describe American politics and Japanese politics, and clearly the so-called school of pluralism, where you think you have multiple shifting interest groups sort of competing to capture policy, might not apply. But are there any other models, say in political science, that may be of more use to understand what drives the Chinese domestic political process regarding these key decisions on foreign economic policy? And I'm thinking, not very creatively, but an old standing theory, bureaucratic politics, organizational politics, where you stand is where you sit kind of thing. How can we then sort of understand the dynamics of Chinese domestic policy making? Another question that came to mind when you were describing the position of the liberalizers, that the TPP is a direction in which China wants to go. Why not use a TPP to gain that leverage, to commit, to use these trade agreements as a commitment device? And the question here is, of course, that there's a very important precedent. China has done this in the past. That's how it used its WTO membership. But that was 2001. We're now talking at least 2015, maybe later, before China actually joins the TPP. And obviously the position of China's economy has changed. China now the second largest economy. When China joined the WTO, it was prepared to be accepting the rules that had been laid by other members, already existing members. Does that attitude still prevail in China? Or now that China is a much larger economic power, it is harder to stomach the proposition that it's about taking rules drafted by others? Does this at all factor in the discussions in the elite? That perhaps then, more than joining TPP, what would be more suitable for China would be to think about having the RCEP and the TPP concluded, and then have China more of a leading country in a negotiation of the free trade area of the Asia Pacific, for example. Does that factor in at all in the discussions? One dynamic that I saw that ran across the presentations by both Minye and Terada-san is the competitive dynamics. And I couldn't agree more. And actually, Saori Katada and I have a paper that basically sort of captures very much what you both were saying, in the sense that Japan joined the TPP had real repercussions in China's trade strategy, and actually facilitated the emergence of some of the mega trade agreements that we're witnessing today. And in this argument that I developed with Saori Katada, we call Japan an unlikely pivotal state. And the simple question was, before, when Japan was tinkering with the notion of joining TPP, was, if you look at the past record of Japan's trade policy, it was not very impressive, I would say so, negotiating small trade agreements. Many obstacles, as Terada-san discussed, agricultural protectionism and so forth. So how could a country with dysfunctional trade politics trigger major movements in the FTA race, so much so that after Japan was very serious about joining TPP, China became much more amenable to Japan's proposition that an East Asian bloc should include 16 countries, and China became much more amenable to speeding up the negotiation of a trilateral China-Japan-Korea FTA. So for a panel like this, that is trying to come up with what is the interaction between domestic politics and international trade negotiations, I would say that we already have identified several of these mechanisms. The use of trade agreements as credibility boosters, because our answer was that the TPP basically gave Japan the credibility that it had lacked. The use of trade agreements as commitment devices, that you're actually going to go back to your vested interest groups and say, my hands are tied, we have to move forward. So I think that these are all important elements linking what happens in the domestic political arena and what happens at the international negotiation table. And this brings me then, and my last question to Minya. These new ideas about the Silk Road and what was the other title? Common Asia
Destiny.
Common Asian Destiny, very, very interesting. And how do we reconcile that with the more recent difficulties that China has had with its neighbors, in the sense of what I'm trying to get at is that China was very successful in the past in developing so-called charm strategy. And I would say that one of the great coups of that great strategy was negotiating the China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. But lately, China has had much more friction, if you will, with some of its neighbors. And I wonder if that is in any way influencing the dynamics of the RCEP negotiations, and if that could in any way stand in the way of these broader visions for greater economic interaction between all these countries. Terada-san, again, very, very interesting presentation. I agree with all the main points. In your first slide, in which you actually spent a lot of time when you talked about the drivers of Japan's trade strategy or regional economic approach, I completely agree with all the points. The one that I thought I was surprised not to see there, and I would like to ask you why, or if you agree that it should be there at all, to me was again to highlight the link to domestic issues, and that's quite simply the structural reform. The use of the TPP as the fourth arrow, the use of the TPP, as I said before, as a commitment device, and that's why Japan had such a strong interest in joining this trade negotiation. Now, let me ask you one question that I have grappled with. I don't have a good answer, but if we talk about domestic politics of trade strategy in Japan, let me put it this way. If I were to think about the domestic political conditions that would be most conducive for Japan to make big strides in trade strategy and sign on to the TPP, I think they're all present, right? You have a strong prime minister, you have weak opposition parties, many of them in disarray. You do not have, as you described, strong internal challengers within the LDP. And therefore, the question is, if the conditions are there, why is it taking Japan so long to reach an understanding and agreement with the United States? Because I would make the case that the time is also running out for Japan. The credibility of the structural reform agenda in Japan is very much tied to successful negotiation of the TPP. And you cannot expect foreign investors, domestic investors, audiences both inside and outside Japan to have infinite patience. An outcome should happen sooner rather than later. So why do you think, if the conditions seem to be so conducive, Japan is playing so much defensive? Could it be that the United States has no trade promotion authority, or is Japan using that as a good negotiation tactic to try not to commit? I also would be curious to see what you have to say about Matt's remark that Japan needs TPP more than the United States. Do you believe that is the case or not? And to bring it, it's a Washington audience, to bring it to the nitty-gritty of Japanese politics, do you think that the recent cabinet reshuffle in any way helps or hinders the negotiation of the TPP? agricultural politician, Mr. Nishikawa, who has been so important in these negotiations, now is going to occupy the position of agricultural minister. Does that in any way change things, or should we expect the same dynamics to develop? I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, for providing us quite a few tough and difficult questions to answer. Well, probably need some small time to consider. So, in order to provide it to us, maybe I should ask some people in the floor to raise questions. And then probably we have 20 or 25 minutes for Q&A. So, hopefully we try to have a second round for Q&A. But let me start with the first round, and accepting a few questions, maybe 3 questions from the floor. Then I'll ask each speaker, including myself, to answer Maria's question as well as the floor's questions. So please. Okay, first and second. Okay, Professor Gilman, and then the third over there. Okay, microphone. Maybe you should come up to the center to use the standing microphone. Thank you. Also, please identify yourself, your name or institution you belong to.
Thanks very much for having this panel. My name is Brian Dabbs. I'm a reporter with International Trade Today. My most pressing question was basically spelled out verbatim by Gonzalez at the end there. Is if the conditions are favorable for the Prime Minister being able to maintain control despite the controversy that surrounds TPP, then why have the Japanese maintained resistance to making concessions? And then if you could comment just to the panel, if you have any particular insight, certainly the U.S.-Japanese market access negotiations have been incredibly opaque over recent months. And I think the last kind of concrete negotiation position that we as a public were able to have access to said that Japan was still insisting on maintaining exemptions for roughly 535 tariff lines, and if you can, if you have any insight to where that figure might be at the moment, I think that would be very helpful. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Gilman.
I'm Gil Rosman, formerly of Princeton, now in the ASEAN Forum, and my question is to Minya. And I think what your research is really fascinating, and it sheds a great deal of light digging into the different views in China right now on an exciting subject. But I'm wondering if you think your sample might be skewed, because you talk to people interested in trade who are more likely to say, oh, we've got to move forward, and you may not be capturing the voices of the skeptics and nationalists enough. And this particularly applies to your coverage of ASEAN, where you suggest that China is now strongly supporting ASEAN as the center more than the driving force. And yet we see so many ways in which China is dividing ASEAN, as we think in terms of the meetings of ARF and elsewhere, where China seems to be working more bilaterally or worried about ASEAN on the code of conduct and so on. So can you give us more of a sense of the skeptics, the nationalists, and what basic issue they want to emphasize as they're dealing with the problems of trade?
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you again to all of the panelists for the very interesting presentations. My name is Ben Garten. I'm a current student at Johns Hopkins SAIS, Japan Studies for International Relations, and appropriately this question is for Terada-sensei. Primarily what I was interested in is during your presentation you mentioned that the agricultural liberalization is one of the key sticking points for Japan to currently accept the TPP and really move forward on that. But it occurs to me that the agricultural sector in Japan is only responsible for about 1.1% of the GDP output, at least as of 2013. So why is there such an outsized influence when it comes to the agricultural sector, and what's the real challenge that needs to be overcome there?
Thank you very much. So let me start with
Okay, all very good questions. I won't try to answer all of them, especially since many of them were not addressed to me, although I'm going to try to answer one that wasn't addressed to me. But so on, well, actually, sorry, before I begin, can I correct a number that I used? I realized that I used the wrong number when I cited Peter Petrie's findings about the global income gains from TPP. That number, as I recall, is closer to 300 billion. For RCEP, 500 billion. So RCEP actually has a more powerful effect, presumably because there's more to gain from within the RCEP region in terms of market liberalization. I just wanted to clarify that it's 300 billion. It's still a big number, and the 2 trillion is definitely close to his number. So on Maria's question, yeah, look, I agree that the politics is difficult in the United States. It's difficult and getting more difficult on trade, and that's a proposition that even doesn't yet get to the issue of the fractured consensus, which I also agree with. Right now, there's an additional problem beyond the sort of challenges of trade itself and the feelings about globalization, about the complexity of the agenda itself, and this behind-the-border set of issues and inequality issues. I mean, there's just a pure political dysfunction between the executive and legislative branch, which is striking and certainly gives me serious pause about whether this is doable, and certainly about the timing of getting it done. So I don't mean to be overly optimistic, particularly because of that latter factor. I think on the first factor, it's complicated, but I still believe the U.S. Congress has never rejected a trade agreement of this type. Somebody's going to challenge me on that. There's probably some small thing, but some kind of major treaty-like negotiation like this has never been rejected. So I think if it does get to Congress, I still think there's a majority of congressmen who will want to support something like this and want to support trade. The pure politics point, in other words, let's just cut to the chase here, the fact that the Republican Party in Congress doesn't want to give President Obama any kind of victory on anything, and President Obama maybe doesn't want to work with the Republican Party to give the full story on anything. I think it's possible, not necessarily even probable, but certainly possible, that after the election, the midterm election, if the Republican Party gains a majority in both houses of Congress, which seems to be the conventional wisdom. I'm not a political prognosticator, so I don't know what is going to happen. If I did, I'd probably be making more money doing something else. But if that's the case, then I think it is possible that while I agree, if this gets delayed too long, it gets too close to the presidential election, it's going to become virtually impossible. And therefore, there's a sort of narrow window after the election to get this done, after the midterm elections to get this done. Make one maybe too subtle distinction between the problem of trade for an individual presidential candidate, Republican or Democratic, and not wanting to be the one who, a few months before a presidential election says, I just got this big trade deal through that increased income inequality and created losers and all these things that he's going to get criticized for. He or she, I should emphasize, particularly in 2016. And that's a real problem. But on the other hand, as a sort of matter of the Republican Party, again, I'm not a political prognosticator and I don't know anything about the Republican Party beyond what I read in the newspapers, but I just I wonder whether it is possible the Republican Party may feel that on an issue like this, which it broadly ideologically supports, that it might want to show that it can make progress on a major legislative issue like this. As compared with all the other things on President Obama's legislative agenda, this one strikes me as more appealing than any other thing that I can think of that Obama wants to get done. And so, for the Republicans. And so they may conclude, look, as long as we can get it done before the poor person who has to go up against Hillary Clinton is nominated, if we can get this done, it may help us, show that we can get legislative accomplishments on something that we actually believe in. So this is more in the realm of wishful thinking than necessarily hard prediction, but I think there's a possibility there. But I agree with you, it is difficult. On your narrower question about TPA, I think it is important for both the reasons you said. It is, I mean, it's not, I think, as necessary as it is being touted to be by, say, Japanese politicians who are not in this negotiation, and it is sort of a kind of an excuse, although unfortunately I think it's become, it's been so that it bought into the narrative of the debate in Japan that actually I think politicians now believe this, so it's become a real obstacle, even if it is actually only a negotiating tactic, it's actually become a real obstacle to political agreement. And therefore, I go back to, I sort of agree with you that while I actually think you could present a good TPP agreement to Congress, get them to look at that, get the technical TPA authority through so that you can have a clean up or down vote and get it through. I agree that as a matter of perception and bordering on now reality, as a signal of U.S. political ability to deliver this, it has become a problem and an obstacle. And so I would caveat my earlier comments by saying I do think there is a problem with not having TPA done well before the negotiations are concluded. And then finally, I just want to say a word about the various questions, yours and the floor, about Japan, and just it's really to emphasize, or I would ask that question as well. I think I did implicitly in my presentation. Why, when the conditions are so conducive, and when Abe-san has made the difficult decision to start this whole process last year, why is, and by the way, I very firmly believe that China switched its position, whether there's very interesting to hear the nuance about different people, and I want to hear an answer to Maria's question about what, frankly, Xi Jinping, where he falls in that camp, because I think he is the top leadership of China. So I'd be interested to hear that. And those distinctions are interesting, but broadly speaking, the Beijing consensus clearly shifted towards TPP as something that needs to be understood, studied, and possibly joined, or responded to at least, the minute Japan joined TPP. It was not 1 minute before or after, it was when Japan joined that China suddenly changed its perspective on TPP, and that's because of a lot of reasons: economic, strategic, competition, and the fact that this is the place where the rules were being written, not in Geneva where they should be written, and so China had to be part of that conversation somehow. So I think there were a bunch of things going on, but I hope people in Tokyo understand, because I believe this strongly is the case analytically, that that's why China moved, that China and Japan, Abe did something very powerful last year when he agreed to join TPP, and he has a chance to do something powerful again. I look at this as Japan's Marshall Plan moment in a way. It's an opportunity to do something big that's going to cost something, but that puts Japan in a position of leadership strategically, and, by the way, gives some economic bang to Japan, important economic bang to Japan itself. So to me, it's a win-win-win for Japan with a little bit of JA losing, but so be it. It's only 1% of the GDP. Sorry, I ran away.
Well, thanks, Maria, for these really, really excellent questions and very complicated. I wrote down and I'll think more, but I do want to just comment on a couple points. Maybe I'll start with the last one. That on the competitive dynamic. I think in China, the only thing that can move is competition and a crisis. So the reason they accomplished a great deal in the from pretty much 1997 to 2008 was due to the Asian financial crisis, the decision that they made after the Asian crisis. And after 2008, the top leadership basically lost interest in multilateralism. So despite these regionalists, the agency, the actors, and the funding are still coming and they are doing things, but there is no political will from the top down. But in Japan, indeed, it's not the United States, it's the Japanese decision to join TPP negotiation that suddenly spurred the interest. but I would be reluctant to say that China has decided on its position on TPP. They paid more attention, but the current consensus is that China is yet to be ready for serious engagement with TPP. And this actually comes to the point that I want to talk about different views. Which view is more influential? This actually, I really like the word evolving. And so currently we do have 3 sets of views in China. And the current, and because as I highlighted, the domestic politics in China are kind of organizational interest driven, or you have different organizational interests, you have different factional interests, and they will speak for different views. At one level, for those agencies that are working on trade and working on regional policies, their policy stances may be between the moderates and the liberals, and they are quite interested in the TPP negotiation, are paying attention to, and are also making serious concessions to ASEAN's demands. And in the RCEP, they are very serious. But on the other hand, I highlighted there are a number of much more powerful political forces in China. Just the economic realm, the NDRC, a super ministry of the State Council, that's in charge of economic development and economic reform. They are more on the bilateral side, developing something that's worked for China rather than being responsive or reactive to regionalism. And along with the NDRC would there be local governments. I'm not talking about like mayors or county level local governments, like heavyweight provincial governors. And these are truly the very influential actors in China. They are the members of Central Committee that select the top leaders of China has this political system. So these actually are very influential actors, as well as the CEOs of the large state-owned enterprises. And these large state-owned enterprises and investment banks, their heads may be more politically higher in terms of political power and ranking than Minister of Foreign Affairs. So these folks are more currently are pursuing the bilateral framework represented by the Silk Road economic ring. That combines the domestic reform and combines these interest groups. But I would not write off the other group, because the leadership actually is having a balancing act in China. Xi Jinping, the common Asian destiny is a new idea. Xi Jinping, when he established leadership in 2013, he in multiple talks he began to emphasize Asia common destiny. But I think the main driver of this idea was to caution the other nationalist groups. The nationalist groups, actually, I don't think the nationalist groups are NDRC or the state-owned enterprise. Rather, those are agricultural ministry and the fishery industries and the military and the coastal guards. And those are more hyper-nationalist groups that are creating some of the very high-profile territorial disputes. And of course, I have to say, the Chinese are feeling that the Southeast Asian countries were also quite aggressive in pushing their territorial claims. But anyway, so I think that the top leader clearly didn't want to see the hyper-nationalist groups to be too active. So this repeated call for Asian common destiny, for call for regional stability, and that's a caution. So that's a warning and to warn those groups to not create too much trouble. But in terms of economics and trade, then the bilateral infrastructure-driven development at this point is proceeding faster than the multilateral projects, and the multilateral negotiations are slower. But I want to add that the Chinese, their trade, external trade, is always secondary to domestic reform. So in terms of domestic reform, they do have big turning point, and that's the state-owned enterprise reform. Just a couple of years ago, the state SO reform was stalled. Now it's the core of domestic reform. So in the labor, the Chinese labor the legislation has been very aggressive as well. So to respond to your comments on external pressure, I think the external pressure is very conducive to China's domestic reform, but it's not a linear process, it's circular. So domestic reform has to go on for a while when the task is more or less resolved, and then the external pressure will complete the cycle. So for instance, WTO membership for China 2001, that pretty much finished the previous round of SOE reform. But SOE reform was already started in 1993. So 1993 to 1998, they already finished most of the corporatization, privatization of the largest number of SOEs. So joining in WTO was completing the process, but not starting the process, because the SOE reform is just a way too big an issue than being dealt with trade. So that the domestic reform is bigger to the Chinese leaders' concern than the external one. But we do call leadership. So now Xi Jinping, although lots of people don't like him, but he appears to have leadership, so some of the, including the regionalist folks that I spoke to, they see now is a moment to do lots of stuff. So everybody is working overtime. I actually really emphasize with that. And everybody in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs are working overtime, trying to get something done in the next year or two.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe quickly, I think first question raised by Millie and also similar. One was the why strong leader like Abe will have struggled with the sort of the not only agriculture, of course, the reforms at home, etc. But when it comes to agriculture, I think the election last year was quite important in this case, because before the election, upper house election last year, LDP had sort of launched the party resolution on protecting so-called sanctuary agriculture items, which means also Japan joined TPP or TPP under the TPP negotiations, 900 items under the 5 categories of the sanctuary agriculture farming the categories should not be taxed at all. So this was a party resolution. And because of it, probably the Abe government got the more votes than the other opposition party. It's not all, it's probably a small reason anyway. So I think the Abe needed to stick to this party resolution. I think that's the reason why this is related to the third question. A new cabinet, particularly Agriculture Minister, Mr. Nishikawa, he was appointed as the chairman for the party committee on TPP. And interestingly, he visited, in most cases, the TPP negotiations to encourage the negotiators. So I think there was sort of the promise made between Abe and Nishikawa that after working so hard, particularly persuading some strong agriculture protectionists within the party, to support the TPP. He might be appointed as a minister eventually. Again, there's no guarantee, but there's a big rumor in Japan. And then he was announced as an agriculture minister. I think most of the people like myself, hey, here we go. So I think the Abe might be satisfied with what Mr. Nishikawa did so far. So I think after he became the chairman of the TPP committee within the party, suddenly such big voices against the TPP are pressed. And he was very active internationally. And 2 days ago, okay, after the reshuffle of the cabinet, all ministers were requested to make a press conference. And Mr. Nishikawa's press conference, the issue which related to TPP was that, don't worry about liberalization on beef and pork, which the United States has currently targeting. So this means, without which probably Mr. Nishikawa-san realized bilateral market access negotiation between Japan and the United States could go anywhere. So in this case, Japan, according to his statement, is ready for making some concessions on this specific product. But he added, this might be another condition which the United States might agree upon, which is safeguard. Safeguard means if sudden increase of the imports observed as dangerous for the certain industries, the nation, like Japan, for example, could increase the tariff ratio to stop the imports. Again, this is another issue currently discussed between Japan and the United States. So Nishikawa-san, according to his first press conference as the agriculture minister, okay, Japan was ready, but this condition should be accepted by the United States. I don't know how it's going on, but it should be probably issued in the next month something between Japan and the United States. So I think Nishikawa-san's appointment may be quite significant as a trade minister who knew probably best about TPP, both domestically and internationally, within the cabinet. So I think as a person who tried to placate the oppositions within party and within Japan, and also working so hard as a table negotiator for the US, like Mr. Froman. So that's a very interesting appointment, I thought. So Abe is now, I said, now all of you know that the advisory committee report has been released, including, as I mentioned, on a working group paper on agricultural reforms. So this is time for Abe, particularly under the second administration period, to implement it. And as I mentioned, agriculture is not exception. So again, strong leader and few more years hiatus of election, it's certainly good condition. And finally, TPP was more important to Japan than the United States. When it comes to security defense, yes, that's right. Particularly, it's not Abe who announced Japan's participation in TPP. It was done by Mr. Kan initially, and then Mr. Noda, relatively weaker prime minister in Japan. And during this two prime minister period, Japan's participation was not realized. But Kan's announcement was quite suddenly made. There are several factors pushing him. One was obviously Hatoyama's idea on East Asian community, excluding the United States. Under which US-Japan relationship became quite bad. So US importance was highly significantly stressed when he became prime minister. So he received a memo from Hatoyama, East Asian community should continue to be emphasized as a significant foreign policy agenda, but he ignored and started talking TPP as a framework for strengthening US-Japan relationship. And this was particularly realized when the Senkaku problem became apparent in October in 2010. So when it comes to security defense, yes, TPP was very significant for Japan. But I think one footnote on this answer was that
Japan has CJK and RCEP. If TPP negotiation were broken down, Japan might be putting more energy and time for another frameworks. Okay, RCEP are different from TPP, yes, but Japan has also another 21st century oriented trade negotiation, which is the EU FTA. It seems to me EU's demand was harsher than the United States because it includes the more structural reforms like pharmaceutical liberalizations, government procurement. Again, EU are now very much interested in selling railways and the trains. And again, there may be a number of the ways of changing Japanese systems if we accept that. So it must be much tougher than the TPP demands in Japan. But if TPP were broken down, I think Japan probably could be more considering significant in other framework, RCEP and EU-Japan FTAs. Finally, 1.1 question. There are a number of probably ways of answering that. Again, the probably simplest way was the election, money, votes. These two issues are often mentioned, and also people. Because the JA people and the farmers became volunteers for helping the election local offices. That's very important. Because money, donations, and collecting from the savings JA Bank, this is the second largest bank in Japan actually, collecting money and distributing this kind of money to some politicians, including LDP. Particularly big businesses like Keidan stopped. Now they announced the resumption of the donations to the parties. But over the last decade or so, the manufacturing big businesses stopped giving money to the parties. So I think the JA agricultural political donation was much more obvious and highlighted. And another issue is sort of the value of one vote. Obviously in rural areas, the value was much more bigger than the larger states like Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, compared with Hokkaido, Tottori, and some of the Kyushus. And these constituencies suddenly include a number of farmers and only one position competed by different parties. Obviously, farmers voting has much more importance in such a single set constituencies in the rural areas. LDP lost badly in 2007 because of it, because they tried to stop the subsidy. Only subsidy should be made to the larger scale farmers. LDP finally made it, but as a result, LDP lost. So I think that's the reason why the agricultural sectors tend to have more influence politically. Of course, there are a number of ways, but I think this probably is the easiest way for understanding it. Well, unfortunately, 5 minutes has passed from 3, so there's no second round of Q&A, unfortunately. But I hope you have enjoyed the discussion in this panel. Again, as a panel organizer, I'd like to carry my large gratitude first to speakers, Mashumin and Mireya, and also audiences for staying for such a long period of time, more than 2 hours, patiently listening to our discussions. So again, this is ongoing. Well, I don't know when I can come back next March for the USJI week, but if so, I would be happy to realize, create similar kind of panel to continue to provide, the updated information on the internet. I believe TPA should be passed in the US stuff. Okay, Abe-san's agricultural reform should be more progress. I don't know, but this is sort of the issues that we have to keep our eyes on. But once again, thank you very much for joining us today.